Hi everybody, Sydney Rock here to give you another video on negotiation. I'm filming this during the day for a change, so the lighting's a little different. And today what I want to do is give you a crash course on logical fallacies. I think it's important in general, but it plays a stranger role in a sales negotiation because the client and the vendor, they both have the same goal. Like, they both want to trade with one another. The client is interested in the product, the vendor's obviously interested in the money, and they want to trade. But on the other hand, the incentives are completely opposite from one another. Because from the client's perspective, you want to get, let's say, a trip around the world, flying first class on all your flights, stay in 5-star hotels everywhere you stop, and get all that for 5 cents if you can. Whereas for me, as the vendor, if I can sell you this paperclip for $5 trillion, why not, right? So even though we both want to trade with one another, the incentives are different. So even though we're going for the win-win, we both have incentive to use fallacious arguments in the negotiation. So it's important to recognize them when they come up. And there's a lot of info out there on logical fallacies. But what I would like to do is just scratch the surface. And I think the logical fallacies, they fall into 3 broad categories, which are fallacies of presumption, of ambiguity, and of relevance. And I'm going to give a few examples of each just to give you an idea what I mean. So, an example of the fallacy of presumption is the complex question, where you ask a question that rests on an assumption, and no matter how the person answers the question, it seems to support that assumption. Like, hey Bob, have you stopped beating your wife? That's a pretty straightforward example of a complex question. Another fallacy of presumption is the false dilemma, where you present 2 options as if it's your only options. And honestly, I'm going to be honest, I use the false dilemma dozens of times a day. I mean, again, as I just went over, I have an incentive to do so. And my goal with this video is actually to make my own job harder. Because even though, like, it doesn't always work, it doesn't always work. I've seen a lot of clients just pick a 3rd option that I never mentioned, which is totally legitimate and it's on the table, I just don't talk about it. I've also had clients say, is there a 3rd option? And then, obviously, you know, I'm going for the win-win ultimately. So I'm not gonna lie to the clients as though, no, you have no choice except for option A and option B. But that's a fallacy of presumption. Fallacies of ambiguity. There are some pretty straightforward examples. One of them that gets used all the time is straw manning, or the straw man argument, where you want to defeat someone's argument, so you basically make up this fake argument that kind of looks like what the person is saying, and then you defeat that argument. I don't have any specific examples of a straw man here, but there are examples of that all over the internet. The other fallacy that I like of ambiguity is the equivocation fallacy. Now, this is a particularly tricky one. I like it in the sense that I like detecting it, but it's when you use the same word having different meanings throughout your argument, and then it just flows and it seems to make sense, but you come up to a false conclusion. The example I have here is a feather is light. What is light cannot be dark. Therefore, a feather cannot be dark. That's a pretty straightforward example of an equivocation. So I use the term light in 2 senses. One in terms of mass, the other in terms of light versus dark. The other broad category is fallacies of relevance. There are all sorts of them. Most of them are in the form of irrelevant appeals, like appeals to authority, appeals to antiquity, appeals to tradition, appeals to emotion, all these things. And honestly, clients make irrelevant appeals to me all the time. It happens. It happens all the time. My favorite one is, I'm old, give me a discount. Obviously, they won't say it that way. They'll form it, is there a discount for senior citizens? And, where I work, there isn't any, but I can't blame them for asking because I recognize their incentive to do so. They want the 5-star hotel trip around the world first class for 5 cents if they can get it. Why not? So basically the reason that I'm covering this is because during a negotiation, even though we have conflicting incentives, it's very powerful to be able to recognize logical fallacies when they happen. And even though I strongly encourage you to look up logical fallacies and get more info on there, even though you can't name each fallacy, it's surprisingly powerful to be able to just put them in one of those 3 categories. Is there ambiguity? Is there presumption? Or is there something irrelevant happening? I remember, I think it was 2 weeks ago, I was having a conversation with some friends, and eventually, it doesn't really matter what we were talking about, but I say, yeah, but blah, 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 blah. And she said, yeah, but yada, yada, yada. And I went, irrelevant. And then I went back with my point. I didn't know exactly what the specific fallacy was, but I knew it was an irrelevant appeal. So I just put that aside and moved on with my point. Oh, and before I let you go, I want to give 2 quick pointers. First of all, beware of the fallacies fallacy. A lot of people call this a fallacy. Doesn't really matter what you call it. This is a fallacy of relevance that assumes that whenever an argument contains a logical fallacy, it must be false. An example of this would be all 50 of these scientists agree that 2 plus 2 make 4. Yes, I'm making an appeal to authority. Yes, it's an irrelevant appeal, but 2 plus 2 do make 4. And I think that one's easy to understand. And the other thing that I wanted to say is if you want to watch things as a study in logical fallacies, the main things I would suggest, the first one, I wouldn't suggest watching this all the time, but I think that network television news is a pretty rich source of logical fallacies, especially when pundits are talking about things. They make irrelevant appeals and fallacies of ambiguity and presumption all the time. Another one that I really like is I don't think it plays anymore, but the Ancient Aliens series on the History Channel. I remember watching a few episodes of that, and they are very, very good at asking questions and then trying to move on as if they had just said fact. Could such and such temple be a secret gateway to the stars? According to ancient astronaut theorists, it is. And that's one example of the kind of things I think that the Ancient Aliens series is really rich in these kinds of logical fallacies. Another one that I would recommend, if you want an advanced course in logical fallacies, watch an Obama speech. Now, before I move on, I don't dislike Obama any more than I dislike any other politician. I think they're all sacks of shit, basically. But Obama, or at least the person who writes his speeches, is a master sophist. Back in the Bush days, when someone who disagrees with what Bush has to say listens to his speech, they'd see right through that shit, right? But if someone who disagrees with what Obama has to say listens to his speech, they're very likely to walk out of there saying, well, I guess he has a point. I never thought of it that way. No, wait. The whole thing is fallacious. Just grab a list of logical fallacies, hit rewind, watch that thing again. I mean, the other day I was watching a speech that a friend of mine shared on Facebook, and I really don't feel like getting into the Zimmerman stuff. It's not relevant to this channel, but it just so happens to be what that Obama speech was about. And he opened the speech by saying, I know that stand your ground laws have nothing to do with this case, but, and then he goes on for almost 20 minutes to talk about stand your ground laws, as if it had something to do with the Zimmerman case, which at the very beginning he admitted it doesn't. It doesn't. There we go. And the whole thing sounds completely logical. And if you're not on the ball you're very likely to walk out of there saying, "Oh, I guess he has a point." No, the whole thing was fallacious. So those would be the main sources. For more advanced study of logical fallacies from the theoretical standpoint, I would highly recommend the Logic Saves Lives series on the School Sucks podcast. I'd recommend the School Sucks podcast in general. That show is fucking amazing. But I'll put a link down there as far as the Logic Saves Lives series, because I think it's great. It's hours and hours and hours of study on logical fallacies from a more formal perspective, but I wanted to give you just a crash course. You don't have to know all the logical fallacies, but it's very powerful to at least be familiar with the three broad categories, and it'll give you much more power when you're having a negotiation with someone and they present you with a fallacious argument. And again, if your incentives are there and you want to try to slide one by the person, I mean, I have no problem with that as long as it stays moral, as long as you're not committing fraud. So I think that'll be it for today. So this is Sydney Rock signing out. Thanks again. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks again for taking the time to watch this. Later.